Please welcome Mr. David Epstein.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Let's see if I can get some slides up here. Great. So, we can start that timer. Or I'll just do it this way. So, having written a book about genetics and athleticism, I'm sure it will surprise you to know that I'm asked on a weekly basis by someone who has a child how they can make their child into a legendary athlete. Right? This has become a regular occurrence in my life, and it's actually a really, really difficult question. And I want to give an example and show why it's such a difficult thing to try to address. And to do that, I want you just to imagine for a second last year's World Championships of the 100 meters. It was held at Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow. So just picture the environment there. 50,000 fans, all waiting to see Usain Bolt, the fastest man in history, the Jamaican sprinter, right? Picture it. Flashbulbs are popping around the stadium as the 9 fastest men in the world coil themselves into their starting blocks. And now if you'll just humor me for a second, just close your eyes and picture the race. Try to picture that environment. It'll be cool if everybody does it. Ready? Bang! The starter's gun goes off. An American sprinter jumps out to the front. Usain Bolt starts to catch him. Usain Bolt passes him. And as the runners come to the finish line, you'll hear a beep as each man crosses the line. You can open your eyes now. That's the entire finish of the race. That's the 9 fastest men in the world. That first beep was Usain Bolt. That second beep, raise your hand if you have any idea who that second beep was. Nobody, not one hand. The difference between those two performers is 0.5%. And that's the difference between an athlete who's incredibly valuable and a living legend and a guy who's completely anonymous even in his home country. If you could distinguish that fourth beep, that guy who finished 4th, he has to have an off-season job as a roofer. He's 1% back. The difference between that 3rd and 4th beep is the difference between someone who can do this full-time as a professional and someone who has to have another job. And the difference between those two is actually less than 0.5%. So the famous biologist and author Stephen Jay Gould had a hypothesis about human endeavors, that the longer they went on and the more people that engaged in them and the more time that went on, as we figured out what variables matter, excellence would spread through a complex system and performances would converge. And this has happened to a great degree in elite level sports, to the point where the difference between legendary and anonymity is often 0.5% now in sports. So it's getting harder to distinguish athletes at the top level. And 0.5% is less than the margin of error of much of what's done in elite sports science, which makes it really difficult to answer the question of how do you make someone legendary, right? Listen again to the finish of that race. See if you can distinguish the 3rd beep from the 4th beep. That's the difference between professional and needing an off-season job. Ready? That's it. Those are the kind of differences we're talking about. So the question that's being asked is, how do you get that 0.5%? So what's the answer? Well, it depends who you ask. Does anybody want to be really brave and try to volunteer what these 3 things have in common? Champagne, razor blades, and diapers? Oh, sure. Are they all endorsed by some major athletes? I'm sure they are. I don't know an athlete that endorses Pampers, but I'm sure there's one out there. And thank you for guessing. What these 3 things have in common is actually if you buy these 3 things and only these 3 things at an American convenience store, you'll get flagged for credit card fraud when you walk out. This turns out to be an incredibly common purchase pattern for identity thieves. Apparently, champagne and razor blades are really easy to flip on the black market, and identity thieves buy diapers because they think it'll make them look non-threatening when they go to check out. This pattern was discovered by a man named Vivek Ranadive, or by a company run by Vivek Ranadive. All they did was his company would work with credit card companies to go through millions, in fact billions of purchases, cross-reference that with fraud and pull out patterns of credit card fraud. Vivek got really, really good at doing that for credit card companies. He got so good at doing that, actually, that he was able to buy the Sacramento Kings of the NBA. So Vivek is now the owner. And like many tech entrepreneurs who are now moving into ownership and management in sports, Vivek made his fortune using big data. He has great faith in big data to find that 0.5% in sports. But if you happen to follow the Sacramento Kings, you know how well that's been working out. Which is to say that it hasn't been working out at all. And big data in sports has been wonderfully descriptive at telling us why some people we didn't know were good are good, and at sort of informing our analysis of sports, but it's actually not been that good after the low-hanging fruit at helping people themselves get better. And I think in the rush to big data, we've actually jumped over the utility of what I want to call small data. And I want to give you an example of what I mean by small data. And to do that, I'm going to give you the simplest example that I can think of, and it comes from UK sport. When the UK was awarded the 2012 Olympics, they invested heavily in creating what they called determinants of performance. That was figuring out what matters to a given sport. And I want to give you the simplest example they made using the simplest sport they started with was shot put. There's only 3 determinants of performance in shot put. Very simple sport. The release velocity of the shot, the height of release of the shot, and the angle of release of the shot. That's it. That's it. 3 determinants. So they said, well, let's look at how this plays out in a competition between 2 of the best people in the world. So they took a look at that and said, well, let's analyze these parameters. Okay, well, in release height, the guy who actually got silver was better than the guy who got gold. All right, well, what about release velocity? In release velocity, the guy who got silver was better as well. And that's kind of the hardest one, so he's probably a better athlete, because that really involves your explosiveness and your technique. But he threw it, the guy who won the gold threw 1.5 degree higher angle, 1.5 degree higher angle, and won the gold medal. Now, what if the guy who won silver, instead of throwing 31.5 degrees, had thrown 1 degree higher? Instead of throwing 70 feet and 11 inches, he would have thrown 72 feet 4.5 inches, and he would have alchemized that silver into gold by throwing 1.5 degrees higher, 1 degree higher. So UK Sports saw this and said, let's try to apply this to other simple sports as a start. They moved on to more complex sports later, but they started with simple sports. They said, well, how about long jump? We know that only has 3 determinants of performance: speed down the runway, force into the jumping board, and the angle of the jump. That's it. So they hired a PhD biomechanist, of which there are precious few in the world, and gave her the title of Horizontal Jumps Specialist. How's that for a specialized title? Her job was just to watch research-grade video of long jumpers going over and over and over and figure out what she could change from those 3 determinants of performance. She figured out really quickly she couldn't change their sprint speed. She couldn't change their force into the board. They already, at that level, had really good technique. But she found she could change their jump angle quite easily, actually. So she spent 2 years working with Great Britain's best jumper just on his jump angle, nothing else. And come the Olympics, he didn't have one of the 10 fastest approaches into the board. He didn't have one of the 5 highest forces into the board, but he jumped at the perfect angle and won the gold medal. So there was a guy who was not one of the best athletes in the world in his sport. Very, very good, but not one of the best athletes. And by finding not just what mattered, but more importantly, what mattered and what she could change, this scientist was able to give him that 0.5% that made him a gold medalist. We've spent so much time with big data in sports finding things that matter, most of which we have no capacity to change. So when I say small data, I mean finding things that matter and that we can change that don't necessarily just jump out of big data. And I want to give another example of something that's coming out of sports science that couldn't be found with big data really recently, that's becoming very in vogue, and it comes from golf. Turns out that in any kind of targeting task, shooting free throws, kicking free kicks, putting, what an elite performer's eyes do right before they execute is different than what lesser performers do. So I want to show you what Tiger Woods, or better yet, Rory McIlroy's eyes do in the 2 seconds before he putts. They go like this. They focus on the back of the ball. 1, 2, he putts, and that's it, and they go back. Now in contrast, let me show you what a lesser golfer, what an amateur golfer does. By amateur, I mean like a scratch amateur golfer. These were very good golfers who were studied. In the same 2 seconds, it does this. It hits 6 different spots in those same 2 seconds. And the golfers don't know that they're doing this. When scientists tell them to stop doing that, they say, well, what are you talking about? I was looking down at the ball. But it turns out if you can come up with a way to coach it implicitly, this is probably a proxy for the brain, this eye stillness, a calming of the mind. And so when these putters were told, well, stop doing that, the pros don't do it like that, they said, well, what? I don't know what I was doing. But if you give them, say, a word under the ball, tell them to get set to read it and not lift their head until they've read the ball after they putt, in 2 weeks, they will conform to the eye patterns of more elite golfers and take 1.9 putts per round. And these are scratch golfers in 2 weeks. So this, again, is an example of finding something that matters and that's very, very easily changeable. Hey, but I want to go a little bit backwards now in athlete development, because this is about finding that 0.5% once you're already at a very high level. What about getting to that level in the first place? And I want to tell a little bit of my own sports story. This is me in college when my lower to upper body weight ratio was much more favorable than it is now. And I'd played football, basketball, baseball, American football in high school. I know you're all surprised I didn't make it to the NBA. And then I found track and I became what's called a walk-on runner in university in the United States. And walk-on means I wasn't good enough to get recruited, basically, but I was stupid enough to show up. And so in college, I walked on and I was paired with this guy, a guy named Scott, who was already a national level runner for Canada. You can see him wearing his Canada kit there. And we were probably paired together because there's sort of tradition in the US of putting walk-ons with highly touted recruits for the purpose of making sure the walk-ons don't come for the second week. They usually disappear, right? Scott, I ran the 800 meters, or half mile, depending on where you're from. Scott was 20 seconds faster than me in the 800 meters when we were both juniors in high school. That's a half mile, right? That's a tremendous difference. So when we started training together, I couldn't do everything he was doing, so I would do lesser multiples of what he was doing. And a strange thing started to happen. I started to catch up to him. And at about 1 minute and 52 seconds for 800 meters, which was now 30 seconds down from where I'd run as a junior in high school, I passed him, and I kept getting faster, and he never beat me again. And I kept getting faster, and he stagnated. And it led to this interesting environment for us on our team where our coaches and teammates would tell me, like, wow, you have no talent, but you keep improving. Man, you're so tough. And I'd be like, yeah. And where Scott would be told, like, oh, you've got all the talent in the world, but you stagnate, you're a head case. And so they'd start giving him pep talks before all the races, like, you just need to be calm. You're more talented than everybody. And I don't think he was a head case until they started giving him pep talks. So I was around him. He was tough as nails. He was doing more training than I was, if anything. But I wasn't going to negate this kind of flattering narrative, right? Because it led to all this really cool stuff for me. Like I won my university's award for the athlete who achieved significant athletic success in the face of unusual challenge and difficulty. Pretty neat. My unusual challenge and difficulty, of course, just being that I stunk at first. Right? So I always knew there was something wrong with this narrative because I was living with the guy and I saw what was going on. I wasn't training as hard as him, but I didn't really know what it was until I got deep into genetics and my own genetic testing and the reporting of my book. Now this, you don't have to pay too close attention to this data, but these are some of the results from one section of the most famous exercise genetics study of all time, called the Heritage Family Study. In this section, 98 two-generation families were put on 5 months of identical, rigorous cycling training, tightly controlled in 4 different university labs. And the goal of this part of the study was to look at changes in aerobic capacity. That's the amount of oxygen you can move through your bloodstream when you're working as hard as you can. It's an incredibly important predictor of endurance. And so here you see the ranges of improvement. You can see on the left, some people after 5 months of training, going from nothing, all these people went from nothing, had no improvement or got a little worse, which is kind of stunning, going from nothing to 5 months of training. But there was a very small number of people. A very small number of people got way, way, way better. Most people were sort of in the middle. And families tended to stick together. And in 2011, these scientists found a 21 gene predictor set. That's different versions of 21 genes. They could predict who was going to improve in response to this training before they even started. So people who had at least 19 of the so-called favorable versions of the genes improved the amount of oxygen they could carry 3 times as much as people who had fewer than 10 of those genes on identical training. So just like the revolution that's come out of medical genetics has shown that because my gene involved in acetaminophen metabolism is different from yours, I might need 3 Tylenol, well you only need 1, or maybe Tylenol doesn't work for me at all. Exercise genetics is finding the same thing. No 2 people's 1 hour of practice is the same. No 2 people respond to any given training stimulus the same because of differences in their genes, right? This causes a problem for things like the 10,000-hour rule that have the underlying assumption, something called the monotonic benefits assumption, that each hour of strenuous training moves each person forward the same amount. This has been heartily debunked by genetic science. Another really interesting thing that came out of this section of the Heritage study was that the correlation between baseline ability and ability to improve was 0. Not low, 0. So on day 1 of the study, the scientists said, here are our 10 most talented performers. They missed 100% of the people who ended the study looking the most talented. No correlation between baseline and trainability. If you think about it, that's a pretty profound restatement of what talent is. Because what we usually do is we line people up on a day, we say this is the most talented person, but exercise genetics is showing that trainability is the more important kind of talent, and that it varies between people. And when there's no correlation, you can tell in most cases we're looking for the wrong kind of talent. I was a classic case of what they would have called a low baseline, high responder. Terrible at rest. And I have almost all of the gene set that they would want for improvement. I was so bad when I started running, I went to get examined by a pulmonologist. You can see the report says I was showing early stages of emphysema. This is one season before I ran at the US National Championships, which is our trial for the world's team, in the 800 meters. Now, most people like me probably didn't make it through, so I got a little lucky or was a little stupid or whatever, but most people would have gotten screened out, right? Because our idea of talent is something that we see in the moment. So in addition to just getting these little tweaks at the top, before we even think about that 0.5%, we have to think about getting people in the right slot in the first place, and that means finding where they're most trainable. Not only the sport, but the specific training stimulus that works for their genes, and has to be tailored as much as medication has to be tailored based on genes. So before you even get to that space of the 0.5%, right, we have to get in the right spot. And why is this important, this reconception of talent? Well, it's important because of something that we all know about the development of elite athletes, right? We all know that elite athletes in aggregate numbers, they practice more than near elite athletes, no surprise. They spend more hours in deliberate, effortful practice. This is data from aggregate studies of team and individual sports. Right? That's obvious. You've heard of the 10,000-hour rule. It's the idea that 10,000 hours of practice, there's no such thing as genetic talent. There's 10,000 hours of practice is necessary and sufficient to make anyone an expert. And in this idea, this has caused a major push in the US and in some other countries toward early hyper-specialization in sports. Because if only accumulated hours of practice, if that's the only real advantage in sports, then you want to get started as early and specific as you possibly can, right? So you can start accumulating these hours. But when scientists look at the actual entire life development of elite athletes, it looks like this. Athletes who go on to become elite practice less early in life in their eventual sport than athletes who go on to become near elite. So if the theory of the 10,000-hour rule is that early hyper-specialization is what works, it is completely falsified by the entirety of sports science, which gets none of the press of the 10,000-hour rule. So what's happening in this period when future elites are actually practicing less? This holds in music, by the way, too, which people think is a must early specialization. But actually musicians, athletes, air traffic controllers, they go through this early period that scientists now call a sampling period, at least through age 12, when they have this period of extreme brain flexibility. You can still change your native language through age 12, where they gain a range of general skills and they test things. They niche sample, looking for that environment that fits their genes. So the normal path to expertise is the Steve Nash, two-time NBA MVP, played a variety of sports, didn't own a basketball until he was 13, 8 years behind me, worked out okay. Roger Federer, parents forced him to continue playing badminton, basketball, soccer, until he was 13 and not focusing on tennis. That's the normal path, and it's the only one we never hear of, right? We never hear of this pattern in sports science. All we hear is the 10,000 hours. The actual pattern that elite performers follow, and it's consistent in a wide range of skill acquisition, not just in sports, and it reminds me of this quote that I love from J.M. Tanner, who was a world-class hurdler and was the world's expert in body growth and development. Everyone has a different genotype. Therefore, for optimal development, everyone should have a different environment. Right? In this sampling period, these athletes, after gaining a variety of skills, which actually shows that they then pick up any subsequent skill quicker, are testing. They're learning about themselves. They're not being overcoached. They are learning about themselves in a way that even science can't tell them, sampling and looking for that environment. The pattern that they follow is a sampling period first, and only then do they find out what matters and what is changeable. But we're going exactly away from this pattern, especially in the US. I want to think about that for a minute. So what's happening in the US because of the 10,000 hours hype is we've pushed kids continually to specialize earlier and earlier. And what that's done is it's caused teams, sports teams for kids in our bigger cities to become incredibly competitive at a very early age. So competitive that there's been this kind of race to specialize younger and younger because kids have to pick one sport now at age 5 or 6 or 7. They can't sport sample. They can't do, actually if we can bring that up, I still have another slide I want to show. Thank you. They can't sport sample, so they can't go through this period of finding the environment that's right for them. And the result of that, the result of this well-intentioned 10,000 hours thinking has been that we simply don't produce pro athletes in our cities anymore. So I want to show you some new data from a researcher named Jean Cote in Canada. You don't have to pay too close attention, but this column OR is the odds ratio of a kid making it to the pro level in sports based on the size of his hometown. This trend has now gone to the odds, the odds of a kid from the smallest size of town making it to professional hockey are 18.7 times normal. The odds of a kid from the biggest town are 0.06 times normal. This trend has now taken hold in every single sport in the US, where early specialization, well-intentioned, has made sure that we don't produce good athletes from these places anymore. I can show you any sport you want. Baseball, 20.8 times more likely from the smallest size of town where the kids can't specialize. 0.17 from the biggest towns where they have to specialize. Basketball, we think of basketball stars coming from the inner city. Not the case. Not anymore. Now they're coming from the smallest cities. I can show you any sport you want, and this trend now holds. Because with good intentions and 10,000-hour rules, thinking, we've extinguished this sampling period that's so critical to producing elite athletes. Thank you very much.